So we continue our discussion now about contexts, the various circles of contexts that help us to interpret and understand and perhaps even apply to our own setting a text like the Gospel of Matthew. And we've just finished talking very briefly about literary context, and we focused on this idea that texts are made up of words, and that knowing the definitions of words and knowing the idioms and the relationships between words in the ancient world is a really critical first step to beginning to understand a text that has as much separation from us over 2,000 years as we do between ourselves and the Gospel of Matthew. That's the first step. But one of the best ways that we access that information, or we put that literary information into a broader setting, is to study what we call historical context. That's the second circle of context that I want to look at for just a few moments here. Historical context is really looking at the world behind the text. If we said literary context was the world in the text or the world of the text, then historical context is the world behind the text. It's almost as though if the gospel was a movie. And if you were sitting back to watch this movie in a theater, you may see the protagonists or the main story being acted out. But if you think back to some of the iconic movies that that our culture, our society has seen in the past number of decades, things like Star Wars or The Lord of the Rings or some of these other grand epic stories, they're set in these entire worlds. So even though we see a specific storyline or several storylines being enacted before us, behind those stories are worlds that give shape and depth and color and scope to the stories that we're watching. And that's exactly what we want to do with the Gospel of Matthew. We want to take as much opportunity as possible to look behind the characters and the words on the page and see the depth and the color and the scope. Things like social values, political agendas and political figures, economics, geography, many of the things that we take for granted, religious groups and commitments. These are all items of the first century world that are lying just behind the words on the page. And so looking behind those words, looking at the world behind the text, we're looking for these kinds of things. The goal here for us is not just to read Matthew's gospel, but to encounter the person of Jesus in his own setting and to have a sense of what life might have been like in first century Palestine. Now, don't confuse that word Palestine with our current way of referring to peoples in the Middle East as either Israelis or Palestinians. That's something somewhat different. It's an ethnic category. I'm referring to the Roman province of Palestine in the ancient world, in which many Jewish people who inhabited what traditionally was the land of Israel would have lived. So Jerusalem would have been located in this Roman province called Palestine. I'd encourage you to poke around a little bit and perhaps do a couple of different things on your own. Search for a map of biblical lands and have a look at ancient Jerusalem in the first century or the Roman Empire in the first century in the Mediterranean world. Have a look at where Palestine is and how it's situated. And then you may even want to just, use a little tool or go to Google Maps and just do the sort of map that onto what you discover of that part of the world today. And you'll recognize some of the names and the places from current news and political discourse, and you'll be able to make that connection back to these places in the ancient world. And one of the goals of doing historical context is to say, a text like Matthew's Gospel isn't just some story or some fictive creation. It reflects the lives of real people in real places at a real time in history. And so that's one of the real benefits of doing historical context. So let's pay attention, and here are some key terms, to the who, the when, the where, and the why of the various details, the people, and the places that we encounter in a text like Matthew's Gospel. So as we learn to pay attention to these details in the text and do a little bit more digging, what was the Sanhedrin, for example? What did it look like when people walked to the Jewish temple but saw the Roman Praetorian Guard located right next to that? What does the geography and the location of the way in which people lived their lives and the way in which these accounts in Matthew's Gospel take shape? How does our understanding of that historical world help us to read the text better? I hope that you'll see that there are several resources given, additional videos that you can watch on the life and history or the life and times of Jesus, background. This will all help with what we call historical context. And you'll also have noted on this lecture outline for this session that I refer to a secret word that you can email me back and at a certain point in the lectures. And I'm going to encourage you at this point, the phrase or the term that I'm going to give you is Pontius Pilate. All right, one of the figures in the New Testament era. And if you just email me back the words Pontius Pilate, I'll know that you've gotten to this point in our lectures. And having looked at literary context and historical context, we'll now take a few moments in a third video to look at what we call contemporary context.